I'm Susan Mcilroy, Chairman of the Francis Bacon Society.
I'm Briony Rawle, a member of the Society's governing body.
Briony is a professional actress and singer, and my speciality is filing. Our talk follows Gary Cordice's earlier presentation to the Society about his experience in acting Prospero in Shakespeare's play The Tempest, and about his discovery of Francis Bacon, which was co-presented with Briony. And now we're going to explore the sort of more the drier side, the historical context, what was happening around the time The Tempest was written, and what were the specific links between the Virginia Company in London, the wreck of their ship in the Bermudas, the play The Tempest, the colonization of America, and Francis Bacon's part in all this.
Firstly, we'd like to acknowledge the work of Nigel Coburn, QC, Peter Dawkins, and the contributors to the Francis Bacon Society journal, Baconiana. With special thanks to Barry Clark for permission to quote from his thesis, a linguistic analysis of Francis Bacon's contribution to 3 Shakespeare plays, one of these being The Tempest.
Scholars largely agree that Shakespeare's play The Tempest is based on the shipwreck in the Bermudas of the Virginia Company of London's vessel, the Sea Adventure. The play contains facts recorded in a conventional document delivered to the Virginia Company 1 year before the play was first performed. Only certain members of the company's council were privy to these facts. Francis Bacon was one of these people. William Shakespeare most certainly was not. The timing is 1609, the shipwreck, 1610, the secret report about it, 1611, the first performance of The Tempest, and then 12 years later, The Tempest is published in the first folio for the first time. 2 years after that, in 1625, the secret report is published for the first time. Among the other contenders for the Shakespeare authorship are Christopher Marlowe and De Vere, the Earl of Oxford. And we are expected to believe that they had also written this play based on facts hitherto unknown, delivered in a report when the Earl of Oxford had been dead for 6 years and Marlowe had been dead for 17 years. So is this the stuff that dreams are made of? We wonder. So when Oxford and Marlowe were peacefully lying below ground, Francis Bacon was above ground. Not only was he above ground, but he had his feet firmly under the table at the head office of the Virginia Company. An excellent placement. So Francis Bacon played a leading role in establishing the British colonies in North America, and the case is well documented. In 1607, just 2 months before the first London Virginia Company's voyagers set sail for America, Francis Bacon gave a speech to Parliament urging that
the solitude of Virginia is crying out for inhabitants.
Virginia was the name Queen Elizabeth gave to the entire seaboard from Florida right up to Newfoundland. Earlier, Sir Walter Raleigh had the conception of a New England, and he spent and lost his fortune, about £50,000, on the project of colonising Roanoke in Virginia. And at that time, there was no government help, no money, no sponsorship, no safety with guards for the ships, nothing at all. In 1606, the Virginia Company of London was given a royal charter by King James I to trade and colonize to trade with and colonize Virginia. It was a private company financed by investors who adventured their capital with the aim of making a profit and not to build an empire. But aren't we pleased that North America speaks English and not Spanish? Definitely. So Bacon was a committed supporter of international trade and colonisation. By 1609, he was a member of the Virginia Company Council, a director, along with Henry, the Earl of Southampton, to whom Shakespeare's Venus and Adonis and Lucrece were dedicated, and William, Earl of Pembroke, to whom with his twin the first folio was dedicated. Francis Bacon was also a founder member of the Newfoundland Fishery Company and a brother of the East India Company. We see his influence in a report of the Virginia Company, True Declaration. There are several of these reports, so this is the True Declaration, which ends in a prayer to God.
So to nourish this grain of seed, the Virginia settlement, that it may spread till all the people of the earth admire the greatness and seek the shades and fruit thereof.
And Bacon's hope became reality. The little grain became the great United States of America. The prayer, without doubt, is written by Bacon. He used those same biblical base metaphors several times, including for the union of Scotland and England.
For certainly the kingdoms here on earth have a resemblance with the kingdom of heaven, which our Saviour compareth not to any great kernel or nut, but to a very small grain. Yet such a one is apt to grow and spread.
Michael Kiernan of the Oxford University Francis Bacon series suggested that the second Virginia Charter
may have been prepared in part by Bacon in his capacity of Solicitor General.
Far from may, contrary to this, a publication by the Middle Temple, one of the 4 London Inns of Court, makes Bacon's prominent role quite clear.
The Honourable James Beck, sometimes Solicitor General of the USA, in his book The Constitution of the USA, writes that Virginia Company Charter of 1612 and the Great Charter of 1618, which will always be memorable, for under it the first representative government in North America was established in 1619, and by it freedom of speech, equality before the law, and trial by jury were assured. These charters were the beginning of constitutionalism in America, and the germ of the Constitution of the United States of America. The charters were put into legal form for royal approval by Lord Chancellor Bacon himself, Treasurer of Gray's Inn.
Yes. None of these early settlements had unfortunately been a success. The types of people that were sent there were convicts and the lowest, the people who were poor with very few skills. Death and disease came from disease, starvation through being abandoned, supply ships not coming back and replenishing stocks, and of course attack by local tribes. And Bacon's ability always, in many aspects of life, to identify problems with clarity, together with his deep ongoing concern for the welfare of mankind, in this case the colonists, are shown in this excerpt, and this is the 1612 edition of Bacon's essays. This is the essay of plantations, which were colonies.
Planting of countries is like planting of woods, for you must make account to lease almost 20 years' profit. The destruction of most plantations hath been the hasty drawing of profit in the first years. It is a shameful and unblessed thing to take the scum of people and wicked and condemned men to be the people with whom you plant, for they will ever live like rogues, and not fall to work, but be lazy and do mischief. The people wherewith you plant ought to be gardeners, ploughmen, labourers, smiths, carpenters, joiners, fishermen, apothecaries, surgeons, cooks, and bakers. Cram not in people. Send supplies proportionably, so as the number may live well and not in penury. First, look about. What kind of victual the country yields of itself to hand? and make use of them. Then consider what victual there are grow speedily within the year. Peas and beans ask less labour, and they serve for meat. If you plant where savages are, do not entertain them with trifles and gingles, but use them justly and graciously with sufficient guard. Do not win their favour by helping them invade their enemies, but for their defence it is not amiss. It is the sinfulest thing in the world to forsake a plantation, for besides dishonour, it is the guiltiness of blood of many commiserable persons.
And all these things seem perfectly common sense to us now, but they didn't then. And this is the aspect of Bacon who had such foresight, could understand problems and express them in a practical way. So to recap, Francis Bacon held an important position in the Virginia Company. He was a committed, practical and humane supporter of the colonies. He compiled the second and third charters of the company, and in the second charter, crucially, the appointment of officials to govern in Virginia was transferred from the king to the council. So a much better arrangement of choosing people who were suitable for the job. And now to the shipwreck in the Bermudas.
On the 8th of June 1609, a fleet of 9 ships of the Virginia Company with 600 people left Falmouth and sailed towards Virginia. On the 23rd of July, they hit a tail of a hurricane about 525 miles from the West Indies. The Sea Venture, which was the flagship of the fleet, captained by Admiral Sir George Somers, was separated from the fleet by a storm off the coast of the Bermudas. The 150 people aboard, in addition to the Admiral and Captain Christopher Newport, the leading discoverer, included the entire command structure of the colony, Sir Thomas Gates, Deputy Governor-to-be of the colony, and William Strachey, Secretary-to-be. The storm pounded the ship for 44 hours. But despite taking on deep water, the entire crew and most of their provisions miraculously found land at Bermuda.
And I think we've all heard of the Bermuda Triangle, and in fact storms are now in that area again. And we also know how superstitious sailors tend to be. But as in the play, The Tempest, the survivors of the Sea Adventure found a fertile island, plenty of food, clear water, a sort of paradise, a new Atlantis. They remained there for 9 months, and they built 2 more ships from the local cedar wood, and then resumed their voyage to Virginia, arriving on the 21st of May 1610, which was so good. But by that time, only 60 of the settlers were still alive. Hundreds had died of starvation or attack from the local tribes.
Meantime, the sensational news of the supposed loss with all hands of the Sea Adventure reached England in late 1609.
And not only that, but bad reports, discouraging letters coming from Virginia. And so the company had to do something to allay this public concern and paint a less gloomy picture. And it published a report, we might call it a sort of PR exercise, in January 1610. And this was the true and sincere declaration of the purpose and ends of the plantation begun in Virginia. They liked long titles, didn't they?
Many months later, in the autumn of 1610, the news of the miraculous arrival of the Sea Adventurer in Virginia was heard in England. The company gave an enormous sigh of relief. Confidence restored.
So it's very much like companies today, isn't it? You know, things go very well, and they have a failure, and things don't change really. In September 1610, Sir Thomas Gates, he was the governor, had arrived in London from Virginia with a confidential report on the shipwreck and the conditions in the colony. And this was called The True Repertory of the Wrack and Redemption of of Sir Thomas Gates. This is a year before the first performance of The Tempest. It was in the form of a letter of 20,000 words, written to the Virginia Council by William Strachey, who was secretary to the colony. And as mentioned earlier, Strachey was on board the Sea Adventure, so this is a first-hand report.
The dangerous and dreaded islands of the Bermuda. They be so terrible to all that ever touched on them, and such tempests and thunders and other fearful objects are seen and heard about them, that they be commonly called the Devil's Islands, and are feared and avoided of all sea travellers alive, above any other place in the world, no habitation for men, but given over to devils and wicked spirits. Yet it pleased our merciful God to make even this hideous and hated place both a place of our safety and the means of our deliverance. I hope to deliver the world from a foul and general error. Indeed, we find them now by experience habitable and commodious and contenting.
So here we begin to see the resemblance with The Tempest. And at 20,000 words, there was a wealth of detailed information. So again, this is the document The Tempest is based on. The Virginia Company attached great importance to secrecy in communications in order to protect its reputation. And you can imagine, they did not want all the news of disease and the dreadful troubles to reach the public. They needed to give confidence to get new investors because they needed money and they needed more colonists. Item 36 of the Council's instructions to Thomas Gates before he set out to Virginia states that letters must be kept secret.
Your Lordship must take especial care what relations, accounts, come into England, and what letters are written, and all things of that nature may be boxed up and sealed and sent first to the Council here.
So the point we're making here, because it's pertinent to who wrote the play, is that the letter from Strachey was highly confidential. It was not available to the public until published 15 years later, which is, at that time, Shakespeare wouldn't have been able to see it because he'd been dead 9 years. So we try and remember these things. The amazing fact of that is really regarded of little importance by Stratfordians because they can't explain it. William Shakespeare was neither a shareholder nor a director of the Virginia Company, and he would not then have had access to the details that occur both in this report and in the play. And as an actor, he would certainly have not had a high profile with them. Actors at the time were men of very low standing. Not only that, but the Virginia Company viewed actors as a threat to the colony because they ridiculed the efforts to colonize. And of course, that's what actors do now. They take the mick, don't they, out of all sorts of high-flown things. It's a very natural thing to do. But what does the Virginia Company say about that?
As for players, nothing that is good, excellent, or holy can escape them. They abuse Virginia. The colony prayer was said night and morning, "O Lord, we pray thee, fortify us against this temptation. Let Sanballat and Tobias, papists and players and such other Ammonites and Horonites, the scum and dregs of the earth, let such swine wallow in their mire."
So I hope you're convinced that Francis Bacon, as a leading member of the council, will have seen this report, but William Shakespeare most certainly would not have seen it. And Strachey describes Francis Bacon
of the Virginia plantation being from the beginning of the principal council applied to propagate and guide it.
He's an important person here. The play itself, however, may have been used for propaganda purposes to encourage new investors the fertile, it's beautiful and the water's wonderful. So also at that time there was a masque, which is like a play, written for the wedding of Princess Elizabeth, who was daughter of James I, at her wedding in 1612. And George Chapman, who wrote this, predicted that riches from the great gold mines of Virginia would come to Princess Elizabeth. Well, in fact, there were no gold mines, but it was quite encouraging, isn't it, for somebody to go over there and pioneer. Try it yourself. A second report was registered by the Virginia Company, published for the public and again targeted at potential investors. This was the True Declaration, a sort of sales document.
November 1610, a true declaration of the state of the colony in Virginia, with a confutation of such scandalous reports as have tended to the disgrace of so worthy an enterprise. Habitable, fruitful, great opportunities for trade, problems of anarchy and idleness rectified by the new governor.
So, pretty good. So who wrote these two Virginia reports that were published for the public?
Nigel Coburn, QC. On stylistic and parallelism grounds, I adjudge Bacon to be the sole or principal draftsman of the True and Sincere Declaration 1609 and the sole draftsman of the True Declaration 1610, two propaganda reports from the Virginia Council. He was a member of the council and Solicitor General renowned for his skill in drafting public reports. He would have used Strachey's letter with the just discrimination and due discretion that the company had asked. The True Declaration is written with much eloquence and passion. It has Bacon's rich mix of lofty intelligence, antithesis, metaphor, aphorism, compression, apt use of Latin tags, classical analogies, and tabulation of arguments. On the 24th of July, 1609, there arose such a storm as if Jonas had been flying unto Tarshish. The heavens were obscured and made an Egyptian night of perpetual horror. The women lamented, the hearts of the passengers failed. The experience of sea captains was amazed. The skill of the mariners was confounded. The ship most violently leaked. And though 2,000 tons of water by pumping from Tuesday noon till Friday noon was discharged, notwithstanding the ship was half filled with water, and those who laboured to keep others from drowning were half drowned themselves in the labouring. But God heard Jonas crying out of the belly of hell. He pitied the distress of his servants. For behold, in the last period of necessity, Sir George Somers descried land, which was by so much the more joyful by how much their dangers were despairful.
Exquisite, isn't it? Baconian writing in a sales document. Using early English books online database, Barry Clark has run rare phrase tests, as Briony mentioned at the beginning, and the rare collation profiling to compare Bacon's work with that of Shakespeare. In the case of The Tempest, Barry has made comparisons against Bacon's work and the Virginia Company documents. Phrases which are in both the Virginia Company documents and Bacon's work include
the mustard seed, vulgar opinion, scum of men, venting the population, and time flies without returning.
Bacon has 13 rare parallels with The Tempest, 3 before the play was written and 10 after. These include
ivy and royalty, a human screen, print of goodness, beyond credit, quicken what's dead, and in some passion.
And there's a highly unusual reference to mountaineers with bags of flesh under their throats. We find this in The Tempest.
Who would believe that there were mountaineers, dew-lapped like bulls, whose throats had hanging at them wallets of flesh?
And in Francis Bacon's parallel phrase from his Silvarum,
snow water is held unwholesome, insomuch as the people who dwell at the foot of snow mountains, or otherwise upon the ascent, especially the women, by drinking of snow water, have great bags hanging under their throats.
Caliban in the Tempest speaks of crabs. This is in the this is noticed in the report. So crabs are apples, we know the crab apples. Filberts, as we know now, hazelnuts. Young scamels from the rock, birds. The cahao bird of the night. And we need to ask the question, how did the author of the Tempest know these words and know what they meant before anything had ever been heard of this in England or was published in England? It's only in that secret report. The author must have read the report. And of course, we could argue that Shakespeare would know reports of other shipwrecks before this one, but what makes this particular sea adventure shipwreck unique is that all hands were saved, not a single life lost, and that the ship was abandoned some distance from the land. Prospero asking about the shipwreck.
Prospero, was this nigh shore? Ariel, close by, my master. But are they safe, Ariel? Not a hair perished. Safely in harbour is the king's ship, in the deep nook where once thou called me up at midnight to fetch dew.
And Strachey wrote in his confidential letter that the ship came to rest at Bermuda,
within 3/4 of a mile of shore, and by the mercy of God unto us, making out of our boats, we had ere night brought all our men, women and children, about the number of 150, safe into the island.
So all the time we're comparing either what Bacon wrote or what is in the Tempest or what is in this report to the Tempest. And it's not, now here's a little tribute to the society. It's not just modern scholars like Barry who've studied the Tempest. Over 100 years ago, in 1914, two contributors to the society journal Baconiana pointed out the close association between Bacon and Strachey, the writer of the report, and the discovery of a book written by Strachey. Alicia Heath highlights the dedication to Lord Bacon by Admiral Sir William Strachey in his book entitled
The History of Travail into Virginia Britannia, expressing the cosmography and commodities of the country, together with its manners and customs of the people. Most worthily honoured Lord, your Lordship ever approving yourself a most noble supporter of the Virginian plantation, being from the beginning of the principal counsel applied to propagate and guide it. Your most worthy and best judging Lordship, who in all virtuous and religious endeavours have ever been a supreme encourager, so inimitable pattern and perfecter, so matchless a master, yet as the great composer of all things made, all good with his own goodness, so be his goodness, your Lordship's, in this acceptation.
So that is what Strachey thought of Bacon. Quite impressive. And a Mr. Ross of New York wrote to us that one of two copies of this book in Strachey's own handwriting is dedicated to Bacon and was given to him.
These two priceless manuscripts slept for 200 years. Then in 1849 they were unearthed and printed by staff of the British Museum. The author of the play evidently read the true repertory and followed it in his descriptions. The vexed Bermudas, the cries of the mariners, the trembling star flaming among the shrouds which appeared to the weary and fasting admiral at the helm. On this strand at moonlight, the hag-born Caliban might roll and growl. Sycorax, the blue-eyed witch, might hover in the cloud racks, and the voices of the winds whisper strange secrets.
Going forward to the 1950s, Baconiana featured a series of articles written by Manly Palmer Hall, who you might know from his work, The Secret Teachings of All Ages.
The brave new world referred to by Miranda is certainly America. Prospero is the magician of the new age, the exponent of the Baconian method. The story is an improvisation upon the grand theme of utopias. It was also in this brave new world that he buried his magic staff and drowned his books. That is, concealed in appropriate places the formulas which were the secret of his power. Thomas Jefferson explained the repositories of the Bacon Group in colonial America, checked their content, and caused them to be resealed for future ages.
And Manly Hall mentions the excavations seeking documents in England, Newfoundland, and Williamsburg in Virginia. And we all know that Bacon wrote some of his finest work after his own personal Tempest. The New Atlantis is another link to the Brave New World, and do watch our version produced by Briony on YouTube. And it is exactly like a play, and the public at the time thought it was true. They thought it wasn't fiction, they thought it was true. And just finally now, a few words about the founding of America and Canada and Bacon's involvement.
The first Bermuda coinage, known as hog money, carried Bacon's crest on one side and a picture of the ship under full sail on the other.
In 1910, the Newfoundland issued a tricentenary stamp to commemorate Bacon's role in establishing the colony. The stamp describes Bacon as
the guiding spirit in the colonisation schemes in 1610.
Thomas Jefferson, the third President of the United States and author of the Declaration of Independence, wrote,
Bacon, Locke, and Newton. I consider them as the three greatest men that have ever lived, without any exception, and as having laid the foundation of those superstructures which have been raised in the physical and moral sciences, men of intellect, reason, merit, and integrity.
It's said that Jefferson carried in his pocket always a portrait of Bacon. So if anyone has any information about that, we'd love to hear it. And finally, who could possibly have written The Tempest? Who had the information, the insider knowledge, the poetic ability, the skill, the trust in good and in redemption? Francis Bacon, yes. Thank you. Yes.
Can you recommend any good biographies of Bacon?
Yes. I think if you want to start as in a sort of an easier read, Daphne du Maurier's Golden Lads and The Winding Stair are both about Bacon, and under her married name as Lady Browning, she was a vice president of the Francis Bacon Society.
Oh.
Yes.
Well, have a look. Say that again.
So it was Daphne du Maurier.
I knew her,
Yes. The Golden Lads, which is about Francis and his brother Anthony, and The Winding Stair, which is about Francis. Yes. But then, yes, there are many. I'll send you a list.
Thank you.
I have to think about it.
And we could put that list underneath this video online for other people as well.
Yeah, yes.
Very interesting to me.
Can I ask you, did we overdo it? Did we make clear why we think Bacon wrote The Tempest?
Yes,
That
very
was,
much,
yes.
yes.
Because there are different reports, and and the things like that Barry talks about, they seem, well, how important is that if a word is in The Tempest and it's been written by Bacon? But it's a rare word, so he goes in that computer and they sift everything out, and then it'll come up, and I think it's what Barry's approach is scientific, basically, nothing to do with emotions. It's scientific. So that's a very helpful way of looking at the authorship question.
Well, the rest of the history is convoluted. How you've done it is very just simply explained.
Yes. But I love these quotations from Bacon and all the other people, and the way they write, and the passion in that true report. You could be there, couldn't you, on that ship, bailing out the water, and I mean, it was the most extraordinary thing that no one died. That was.
They wouldn't have ever met a hurricane before, would they?
No, well, some of them would. Christopher, I can't remember his surname. He was one of the first discoverers, so he did quite a few voyages. Yes, and maybe the other, the admiral and the sea captain. So they would have perhaps come across these things. Yes, certainly.
Right.
Yes, but not the passengers.
No.
And what a tough lot they must have been.
Yeah.
My goodness me.
I suppose you had to just put up with it, didn't you, really, if you were in the middle of it?
Yes, yes.
Sorry, I didn't see your hand there.
As advocates, you've made the case, and I think in one sense, to use the term, you nailed it. And I used to say on the nail was a deal. The
Is
thing
there
is,
a but? You're coming up with a but.
because I'm fascinated by the way in which you, in a way, I think, dealt with the critics and the doubters, and you've positioned him well as the author. But in the content of what you speak about, I listen with another thing, and perhaps for this meeting, I'm going a bit off territory. And it may be for another meeting to consider, which I think they need to put in a formal letter to the society. And it's this question of the founding of the colonies and the enterprise of the colonies, which in a way seem to be driven by ethical, by spiritual quest, by a greater mission in the world scheme to establish the seed and the growth of the United States. And I have to, in a sense, wrestle with myself to look at things in the long game, as they say. And that the new Atlantis, which Francis had envisioned, and with all his cohorts, one has to look at maybe 200, 300 years down the road. Because as a person of colour, and I look at in the history of America what's gone on, I find the noble founding of the colonies and what, in sense, history tells us, somewhat very, it's difficult for me to handle.
To reconcile.
Troubling.
And to reconcile.
Yes.
And I ask myself, this is off here, have asked myself, to what extent, if I was speaking to Francis myself and had spent some time with him, I would obviously put these questions, which this meeting cannot answer. But I would say, how would you reconcile what's happened with your vision?
Yes.
And it leads to a bigger question now, that I ask myself that here was a person with a very deep spiritual mission, and I give him that. So therefore I have to look at it in a very long game. About how the plantations themselves seem to be, in a sense, with all the difficulties, in a way, they were an experiment or an endeavour, a venture. And to borrow this and to take back this term, the merchant venturers, who were very, to this day, very integral to Bristol. The merchant venturers run Bristol, and they were also slavers.
Yes.
And I know, and I'm picking up from, really from the work of this society, a deeper understanding of what we understand to be, and you quite rightly said, what is the difference between these plantations and this mission and empire? what's the noble mission of Atlantis, New Atlantis, and what has become an empire, and with all its turbulence, what might come out of that turbulence. And perhaps in some ways some other writer later on may pick up on, maybe our friend here, may actually try to take France's experience as writing The Tempest and actually vision America through this turbulence from Martin Luther King through Francis onwards.
But you know, everybody makes a big sort of thing about it. It was terrible, the bringing of African slaves over from one thing or another. But at the same time, there are more than 2 million white people that we know of that were also taken and put in slave markets. So you can't really equate the way people were then with the way they are now. They thought totally differently. And also one has to say that some of the African leaders were not so good because they were quite happy
I know this argument, but it's one in which many people try to use it to undercut and undermine. I won't go into that now because it's not the nature
I'm
of
not
this
saying
meeting.
to undermine, I'm just saying you have to look at the bigger picture.
Excuse me, I'm not being an African exceptionalist. What I'm trying to do is enter into what has been discussed today and to understand Bacon in a much wider context of a universalist, a mystic, operating into the circumstances of the day. Has written a work called The Tempest, which we are trying to give relevance and to make, to come to the case of authorship and I'm trying to see his writing in the context today and try to understand the person and the mission in a much bigger way, because I am coming from a particular historical position. I don't deny what you said, but I cannot speak for those people. I can speak for my heritage.
Yes.
And I want to actually redeem myself and reconcile myself to Bacon, but I also want to reconcile myself with the realities of what's happened.
Yeah.
And perhaps to see some Baconian wisdom come through it all.
Well, I think the very fact that he identified that it was wrong to send the poorest, the convicts and all those sorts of people out to the colonies, that he identified that as being the wrong thing, because if these very deprived people were not able to flourish and help everything as much as someone perhaps who had a better start in life. So there is that humanity there, I think. And I think that also he always seems to put mercy, as Gary was saying earlier, together with practicalities. You know, he's also saying grow beans, really, because they've got such a lot of protein. That's how you care for your people, with something very practical. So it was always, the caring for the people was very much in the forefront of that particular essay. And this is how you do it, because unless you do things, your spirituality's got to go hand in hand with practical work, with practical thoughts. It has to be grounded, I suppose. That's what I'm thinking. And in a way, of course, those early people, a lot of those early investors, they were in it to make money, and there's nothing wrong with that. And that's part of how we live, how we produce things, how we create. So they go hand in hand always, I think. And I'm surprised that he had very much money to invest. He didn't ever seem to have much money. But I think we're a mixture, aren't we? So, you know, he wanted the carpenter and the apothecary to go. The builder, someone. It's always, life is always a mixture of different types of people, different ethics, different backgrounds.
Including the labourers.
Absolutely, yes. And say engineers, because another part of that essay talks about how you should get clear water, how you should. So there's always a very, you could say, quasi-scientific view to his thinking about how will this thrive, how will it be healthy, and you have to take into account all those things. And I think that reflects life.
I think we might need to face a certain naivety in Bacon's idea of this utopian land that he's going to, go over and found overseas. And he imagines that all people will just work for the common good and that no one will be driven by their own greed and everyone will just sort of happily mingle together. And that,
you mean in the New Atlantis?
In the New Atlantis,
right.
yes.
Yeah,
and then
yeah.
He didn't necessarily consider or foresee that in bringing all these people to a new land, he didn't foresee the treatment of the native people by some of the colonists and the beginning of the slave trade, and that's a difficult thing that we need to reconcile, I think, with.
That happened again in Georgian times. They sent everybody out. The idea is we just get rid of our criminal class, they'll go out there and it'll be fine.
Yeah.
England will then be a utopia. And of course it failed. And it failed because they had a very good man who, made very strict laws that everything should be, the convicts should be treated well, and that the Marines, if they stepped out of line, they would suffer twice as much. And they were all but starving until the next man came along, who was a much more venal man. And he said, right, okay, you Marines can all have a couple of convicts to work for you. And you convicts, if you work for this period of time, you can then have some convicts. And then it took off. So, maybe there's that side to human beings that...
Maybe it needed the maturity of the idea of colonization, which at this point was quite young.
But it was actually the wickedness, perhaps, of those people, like everybody for themselves, actually made everybody think, gave them a bit of hope, like we're not just stuck in this place, we're now going to work. So human beings are just not perfect. They're never going to be, are they?
Yeah.
Really?
It's a visionary.
And
The world, if there's going to be another golden age, we need visionaries.
Yeah.
we need to do our bit now.
Yes.
A little bit, just a little bit.
I think we're nicer now, hopefully.
I don't know. Yeah.
We don't even think the same way as we thought 30 years ago.
Oh.
Being changed all the time. I think you're
Okay.
probably right.
Anyway,
Yeah, the Sultan
I
General.
think we'll have a wrap on that. Thank you, Geoffrey, though. Thank you.